The job system is one of my favorite mechanics in any RPG, and in my opinion, it vastly improves every game it's added to. Having the ability to mix and match different skills and abilities from various classes is such a unique idea, and in its ideal form, it leads to a huge amount of tactical depth and allows players to take unique strategies into the various encounters they have to face against. It's a system that rewards clever thinking, and to me, there's nothing more satisfying than the aha moment of realizing which job's passive and active skills would go best together. I've enjoyed this mechanic when I encountered it in Bravely Default, Octopath Traveler, and of course, Final Fantasy Tactics. So, upon defeating the tutorial boss of Final Fantasy III and learning that this was the game to introduce the job system, I was ecstatic. Although, I quickly learned that labeling Final Fantasy III as the origins of the job system isn't necessarily the most accurate label. While this is technically the first game to feature explicit jobs and to allow your party of 4 to swap between them at will, there's not much more to the system than that. You can't mix and match abilities from different jobs. Jobs themselves don't have growth rates, so staying in a specific job won't adjust your stats at all. And for the most part, you have all of a job's abilities at base. The main exception is Bard, which learns specific spells on raising its job level, and the black and white magic classes, which have to purchase their magic from the stores, just like in the other Final Fantasy games. Because of this, jobs feel less like a core component of your build, and more like a piece of armor that you swap between as necessary. And the game very much leans into this aspect of things. There are several challenges that you are clearly meant to take on with a very specific job. Although, weirdly, there is one element of the job system that seems to run counter to this playstyle, and that is the capacity system. Capacity is a resource that you gain some amount of after every encounter, similar to EXP and Gil. Instead of being used to level up or purchase items, capacity is used to switch jobs. Whenever you're changing from one job to another, you are required to spend some amount of capacity. The exact amount varies based on a big table I'm not even going to pretend to understand, but the general idea is that classes that are more different from each other cost more capacity to switch between. As such, it's easier to change between Fighter and Black Belt than it is to change between Fighter and White Mage. On the surface, this feels pretty counterintuitive. The point of the job system is you're supposed to be able to experiment with different team compositions and builds, so why would they lock that behind a resource? Moreover, when there are specific challenges that you want a team of 4 mages or 4 dragoons for, capacity just feels like yet another thing to juggle that gets in the way of advancing the story. But at least in my experience, capacity is kind of easy to ignore. You don't get a ton for every encounter, but you also have a lot of random encounters in Final Fantasy III, and I didn't find myself changing jobs often enough that capacity was ever a concern for me. Although, I'll fully admit, it's possible this changes later into the game, as I only played the NES version of Final Fantasy to about the halfway point. You see, as much as I wanted to experience the first version of FF3 so that I could more properly understand the evolution of Final Fantasy design, I have a migraine disorder, and unfortunately something in the Famicom graphics tends to trigger it. I can usually power through for short play sessions, 30 minutes at a time, which is what I wanted to do, but Final Fantasy III has so many flashing lights that I just couldn't handle it. I made it past Kraken, but I couldn't find it in myself to power through any further. Honestly, it's a fitting stopping point because it means the 4 old men can be the real heroes of light. Good luck on that final boss, it sucks dick. Regardless though, I think I played enough of the original Final Fantasy III to see the differences between it and the Pixel Remaster. And aside from the quality of life, there are 3 major changes the Pixel Remaster made. The first was the complete elimination of the capacity system with nothing to replace it. Many of the jobs have seen some adjustment to make them feel more unique, and probably the most impactful change is now far easier to raise your job level. You see, in the NES version of Final Fantasy III, in order to raise your job level, you needed to perform actions associated with that job. So, while these straightforward classes like Warrior and Monk could raise their job level just by attacking enemies, the more specialized classes would have to do more unique stuff. For example, White Mages raised their job level by casting white magic, and Thieves would need to steal items from enemies. To me, this feels like a pretty natural next step from the way leveling stats worked in Final Fantasy II. I didn't mind this aspect of the NES version of FF3, but I also don't think it being changed is a huge deal for the Pixel Remaster. After all, in most cases, if you've gone through the effort of putting someone into a specific job, you're probably going to be using those job actions anyway. You don't go into Thief just to make use of boomerang combat, is all I'm saying. And so that brings us to the jobs themselves, and I'll be honest, they're pretty undercooked. On the Famicom version especially, I don't really know what the vision was with many of these jobs. For example, Ranger is just a weaker version of Red Mage and White Mage. They get bows and level 1 through 3 white magic, but that's it. You know you've got an uninspired build when FF3 Red Mage looks good. Even the more creative options like Thief and Scholar end up falling flat. Thief's whole deal is the ability to steal from enemies, but all you're gonna grab is disposable items, and for the most part, it's just potions and high potions. Raising your Thief's job level lets you steal higher tier items, but even then, the higher tier items are stuff like attack items, which in fairness aren't purchasable, but also aren't exactly a hot commodity unless you're doing some sort of no-mage challenge run. Scholar lets you check on your foe's HP stats or weaknesses, which is nifty, but once you know what's effective against each enemy, there's not really any purpose to a Scholar. They can only equip one weapon type, books, which are by far the weakest weapon in the game. Particularly poor performers like the Scholar and Ranger did get massive reworks going into the Pixel Remaster, but I don't think the changes really go far enough, and anytime you try to build a creative team, you kinda just end up punished for it. It is worth noting there are 2 boss fights specifically designed around the Scholars since they keep changing up their weaknesses. But that feels like less of a point in the Scholars' favor and more an annoyance in Final Fantasy III's boss design. Because it feels like a large number of the challenges you go up against are just gimmicks, and the solution is use the correct job. I already mentioned the boss where you are highly encouraged to use a Scholar, but he is far from an anomaly. Garuda is an infamous foe that spams high damage thunder attacks every single turn. But if you turn all 4 of your party members into Dragoons and spam the jump ability, not only do you avoid the thunder attacks, but you're likely to just one-round him. And later, there's another boss who does a similar thing, spamming the Earthquake spell to incentivize jump spam. One of the late game dungeons is the training ground of Dark Knights, and there, enemies hit with anything other than a Dark Knight sword will duplicate themselves, making for a never-ending wave of foes. Goldor is a minor antagonist who is completely immune to magic. And thusly, you should probably change your mages into physical attackers like knights or black belts. And on the other end of the spectrum, there are dungeons where you are required to get the mini status, which prevents you from dealing effective physical damage. And therefore, you probably want to rock up with a squad of 4 spellcasters. I can understand how in isolation, some of these gimmick fights or gimmick dungeons can feel cool, especially if it's your first time encountering the job system, but personally, the large number of gimmicks really rub me the wrong way. Instead of using the job system for creative team building and finding unique synergies, encounters in FF3 felt much more like puzzles, where you just had to choose the correct job and that was the solution to the fight. But even calling them puzzles feels generous given just how much the game signposts exactly what class you were supposed to use for the next portion of the game. In fairness, there are still some portions of the game that feel like a more traditional dungeon crawl as opposed to the weird series of gimmick fights. But I'll be honest, I'm not a huge fan of these portions either. Dungeon design has not exactly been a strong point in the early Final Fantasy games. Final Fantasy I and II leaned into maze-like structures, with 2 having some really egregious dead ends and trap rooms. And Final Fantasy III does have a few maze dungeons and even a couple of trap rooms, but nowhere near as many as his predecessors. Instead, FF3 has a focus on secret passageways. These secret passageways come in 2 varieties. The first are fake walls that you can walk through, allowing you access to a different portion of the map. The second are objects you must interact with in order to open a secret door. In theory, this could be kind of neat, but in practice, I think the execution is pretty sloppy. The fake walls are easy enough to spot if you've got a perceptive eye, and it feels really rewarding to get extra treasures for paying attention to your surroundings, but in the later game dungeons, hidden walls and invisible paths are used to a pretty extreme extent and just end up forming more FF1, FF2 style mazes. Only this time, it's harder to get a full look at the tunnels you're going through. On the other hand, the secret switches feel like absolute fucking horseshit. In the Pixel Remaster, they are actually reasonable to spot, but on the NES, you just kind of gotta be clicking around at every object in the room until you find the correct one that allows you to progress. And this is like, not fun, it's just trial and error. It's pick a dick all over again. And while a lot of the early game dungeons are relatively inoffensive, the farther you get into the campaign, the worse things get. With the culminating final dungeon being 2 super long enemy gauntlets stapled together, culminating in 6 different boss fights, the final of which is the most horseshit final encounter I have ever had the misfortune of fighting. It literally just spams the same team-wide magic attack every turn, and my entire squad got 2-shot by it, so I needed my mystic to spam group healing, all the while praying that turn order wouldn't fuck me over by allowing the final boss to attack twice before I got a heal off. But unfortunately, given the boss's massive health pool, this inevitably happened eventually. So I'm not ashamed to say I gave up. I didn't actually beat the final boss. I don't doubt that I could have if I had the willpower to grind up for 20 more levels. Apparently, I was severely under the recommendation for the final boss. But none of the enemies before the World of Darkness had given me any trouble, so I didn't have any inclination that I was under-leveled. I did try to change up my strategies, with things like a full Dragoon squad to jump over her attacks, or having hyper ninja offense by throwing shurikens, but in the end of the day, nothing I did was able to even come close to defeating the final boss. And my most promising idea, adding a second healer to the squad, was dead before I could even try it out, because I had only purchased 1 copy of Kiraja. And, unfortunately, once you enter the World of Darkness, you can't go back and purchase any equipment that you missed out on. This was also the case in FF1's final dungeon, and I wasn't a huge fan of it there, but at least you had fixed classes in the first Final Fantasy, and as such, it's far less likely that changing your strategy up would require new equipment you simply hadn't purchased. As such, I found the inability to go back and restock to be particularly egregious in this title. And unfortunately, the World of Darkness is not the only point of no return that Final Fantasy III employs. On the contrary, the game seems kind of obsessed with preventing you from going backwards. With things like getting shipped off to prison, having your airship chained up, crash landing in a city on lockdown, and even in the very early portions of the game, you get trapped on the wrong side of a mountain because a dragon chased you down. And in my first playthrough, I actually encountered a really obnoxious softlock in this point of no return. In order to go forward, you need to enter the gnomish village and give an antidote to a sick gnome. But I didn't have any antidotes on me. My white mage had the poison cure spell, so I opted to spend my early game money on weapons and armor and stock up on potions and antidotes in the mid game. But since I didn't have any antidotes, I couldn't go forward, and I couldn't go backwards to the towns where I could purchase some, so I was just fucked. The gnome village even has an item shop, but it doesn't sell antidotes, just gnomish bread. This oversight was fixed in the Pixel Remaster, but the fact that it exists on the NES sort of goes to demonstrate my frustration with these unflagged points of no return. It's super easy to find yourself trapped in a situation that you're not prepared for and lose hours of progress. After that initial antidote mishap, the specter of potential softlocks hovered over my shoulder for the rest of the playthrough. It's safe to say I'm not too high on the gameplay of FF3, but that's really only half of the equation when it comes to an RPG. In this genre, story can be almost equally important, and the story of FF3 is kind of interesting. It feels like a much more refined version of Final Fantasy I's story. You still play as essentially 4 blank slates, hunting down the crystals in order to restore their power, and much like in FF1, rather than having a long narrative with an evolving world, everything feels a lot more episodic. You start out by curing a village from the Jinn's curse, and then one of the people visiting the village, Sid, asks you to escort him home. So you travel to his village, and next door is a mountain with a dragon on it. So because you're adventurers, you climb the mountain and find a guy who's been kidnapped by the dragon. The 5 of you jump over the side of the mountain, and now you're trapped far away from civilization. So you need to shrink down and meet with the gnomes, then go through their tunnel, and hello, there's Vikings here. So you gotta help the Vikings deal with the angry sea dragon who can only be appeased by defeating a rat who has stolen one of the eyeballs from the dragon's statue. After doing that, you are now capable of sailing across the ocean, giving you even more places to explore and more episodic adventures to go on. Each of these little stories leads into the next, and you do ultimately have the goal of awakening the 4 crystals of light in order to defeat the evil Zane, but the overarching narrative definitely takes a backseat as compared to these mini vignettes. There are 2 main things that elevate this game's story above FF1's though. The first is that each of these episodic tales are more fleshed out than the OG games. Where FF1 had simple scenarios like a prince cursed to sleep, FF3 has hilarious comedy moments like 4 old men who are convinced that they're the real heroes of light. But the much more significant factor, in my opinion, is how much fun FF3's world is to explore. After I first calmed the sea dragon and had a larger variety of the world to explore, I sailed around and looked at my options. And immediately I noticed that the edge of the world had a skybox. We were pretty explicitly on a flat planet. Pretty cool world building detail, but ultimately not a big deal, except for later when we finally get an airship, we're able to fly off the edge of the world, and as it turns out, that's not the edge of the world. We were on a continent floating above the planet this whole time. So we fly down from our continent, and suddenly the world map has gotten a whole lot huger. This was such a jaw-dropping moment for me. probably one of the most exciting twists to happen during all 3 of the early games. And it's not even a plot twist, it's just a reveal that the world is bigger than I thought it was. From a story perspective, I do still prefer FF2's ever-evolving world and the personal relationships you build with so many characters, but in terms of hype moments and aura, it's hard to top FF3's reveal. There is also a lot of cool background lore about how the Warriors of Light are kind of just part of a cycle, and in the previous cycle, the Warriors of Darkness had to save the Dark Crystals to push back the light, and now you have to do the opposite because the darkness is getting too strong, and so there's this kind of cyclical nature to the disasters. It reminds me a lot of Dark Souls. Ultimately, I think the message of FF3 is more optimistic than that of Dark Souls because these destined heroes do keep coming and do keep pushing back the light and pushing back the darkness in order to retain balance, but the whole idea of neither extreme light nor extreme darkness being good is pretty interesting, and I was kind of disappointed that even in the final dungeon, when you team up with the Warriors of Dark, the concept isn't really delved into beyond the surface level. But that's kind of all I have to say about Final Fantasy III. I did still enjoy my time with the game, but it was definitely the one I had the least fun with out of the original NES trilogy. As much as I was disappointed in the undercooked nature of this game's job system, it was cool to see the ideas from FF2 get tweaked and reworked into a form that was more popular than that divisive game. Similarly, while the execution of the dungeon and boss design was not to my liking, these gimmicks indicate a desire to make something other than maze dungeons. We just haven't quite gotten everything together yet. Ultimately, it kind of feels like Final Fantasy is going through growing pains with FF3. And so, while I'm not super high on this particular entry, I'm excited to see where the series is going. And if you're interested in seeing where my retrospective series goes, consider clicking on the subscribe button so you get notified as soon as I upload a new video. Or if you can't wait till then, my patrons all get early access at $3 a month. Speaking of which, I should probably thank them now. Thank you to EVVVVVV, Femtal Illness, Wannabe Cinnabon, Punk Tattoo Guy, Key the Iron Idol, Calamity Callie, Jax McMahon, Saren Galaxy, Rezi, Andu, Ria, Gameboo, Karosa, Fyrant, Your Doctor, Frozen Helm, Padwit, KH, Electric Giga, Girl Boss, Lizard Bong Water, Christopher Bueno, Marin McLean, Jaden, Dylan Solis, Some Trades, Guichi555, Smaz Ruby, Zycrom, Robin D, Alenby, They Thom, Clan, Pillow Willow, Glup Shido, Erica Ford, Perg Knight, YLO1, George Grenville, 7th PM, Jamie Collins, Arvis, Crispy Matthews, Floahay, Amy Hazel, Hungry Heart, Hound Dogs, Lovis Roman, Shinthia, Faulty Videos, Kyle Madison, Derek Williams, Anna Cabana, The Daily Fugel, Faye, Magic Bite, Thoughtful Insanity, Robin Goodfeller, JT Spritter, Ziggy WSB, Dysite, Chris, Root Beer Pants, Queen Eliza, Control Aegis, Roman Kermansik, Nick Knack, Hammersmack, Carrier Has Left, Angel Nap Caceres, Zanwif Not Gino, Flingon, Edward C, Cyrockin 2, Cabbage, SUP, Kaya School, Bree, Punch Fighter Champion, Eggman, Maxine the Vampire Queen, Dragonback Lancer, Sardonic Muse, Zero Gamer, and especially my Jagans, Your Best Friend 9000, Adele, Alexander Roper, Sensitive Luigi, Siggy, Lil Man, and KTRRK2. There's a link to my Patreon below if you want to join these names in the credits, as well as getting early access to videos like this and the ability to vote on polls that influence my channel. But please only donate if you can comfortably afford to do so. I don't want anyone going broke over Fire Emblem or Final Fantasy. As always, comments, likes, subscribes, and hypes are free ways to support the channel, but regardless of what you choose to do, I hope you have a wonderful day. Stay safe, gamers.